Today we are going to look at the most disturbing deaths, from a camper who chose a deadly location that resulted in him getting hypothermia, to a gym owner that got his life taken by one of his employees. Let's dive straight in. It was October 15th, 2017, when 34-year-old Trevor Hastings, a senior software engineer from Minneapolis, embarked on what would become his final camping adventure to Superior National Forest. Known for his meticulous planning, Trevor had been an avid solo camper for over 15 years, though he primarily ventured out during warmer months. Standing 5 feet 8 inches with a lean build, Trevor possessed a confident personality that sometimes led him to underestimate unfamiliar risks. After completing a stressful project deadline, he desperately needed to escape and capture the stunning fall colors around Lake Superior with his camera. Weather forecasts predicted mild temperatures in the 50s, which seemed perfect for photography. However, Trevor failed to account for the lake effect phenomenon that could cause dramatic overnight temperature drops. Confident in his experience, he packed only a lightweight sleeping bag rated for 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Trevor chose a remote campsite 3.2 miles from the nearest trail access point, beyond cell phone coverage. To capture perfect sunrise shots, he positioned his tent in a slight depression near the water's edge, unknowingly placing himself in a cold air pocket where frigid air would settle. Earlier that evening, fellow camper Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old nature photographer from Duluth, had set up camp about half a mile away on higher ground. She later testified that she noticed Trevor's tent positioned unusually close to the water and considered warning him about cold air settling in low areas, but decided against approaching a solo camper in the darkness. Late that night, an unexpected Arctic air mass moved across Lake Superior, causing temperatures to plummet to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Trevor woke in the early morning hours, shivering uncontrollably as his inadequate sleeping bag provided no protection. His hands losing dexterity, he fumbled desperately with matches trying to start a fire, but persistent wind kept extinguishing each attempt. Sarah later reported hearing someone struggling with camping equipment during the night, followed by concerning silence. She considered investigating, but was reluctant to leave her warm shelter in the dangerous conditions. Hours later, Trevor's core body temperature dropped to 95 degrees, triggering early hypothermia. Confusion clouded his analytical mind. Making a fatal decision, Trevor abandoned his tent and began walking toward his car, believing movement would generate body heat. His coordination deteriorated rapidly as hypothermia progressed, causing him to stumble and fall repeatedly. In the pre-dawn hours, with his core temperature at 90 degrees, Trevor collapsed just 0.8 miles from his campsite. His breathing became shallow while his heart rate dropped as his body shut down non-essential functions. Trevor lost consciousness as dawn approached, his body curling into a fetal position among fallen leaves. Death occurred shortly after sunrise when his heart stopped due to hypothermia-induced cardiac arrest. Sarah discovered Trevor's abandoned campsite the next morning when she noticed his tent flaps whipping in the wind with no activity. Concerned, she hiked to the nearest ranger station to report the situation. Search and rescue teams located his body 1.2 miles from the campsite following his erratic trail. The medical examiner confirmed death by severe hypothermia. Investigation revealed Trevor had adequate survival gear in his tent, but panic and hypothermia-induced confusion led to his fatal decision to leave shelter. Sarah's witness testimony helped investigators understand the timeline. His tragic death prompted new Park Service warnings about temperature variations near large bodies of water during fall months. It was August 22, 2018, when 28-year-old Lauren McBride, a seasoned backcountry ranger for Glacier National Park, began what would become her final patrol in the Montana wilderness. Standing 5 feet 6 inches, with an athletic build earned through 6 years of demanding wilderness work, Lauren was known throughout the Park Service for her calm demeanor and unwavering adherence to safety protocols. Her confident and methodical personality had made her popular among both colleagues and park visitors seeking guidance in the backcountry. Lauren's extensive bear safety training and wilderness experience gave her the expertise needed for solo overnight patrols in some of the park's most remote sections. She was conducting a routine inspection of campsites and trail conditions in the park's northwestern section, an area that had recently reported a female grizzly with cubs foraging near popular camping areas. This increased bear activity had prompted enhanced ranger presence in the region. Lauren carried regulation bear spray, a .40 caliber sidearm, and followed all proper food storage protocols to the letter. Her designated camping area was positioned 4.7 miles from the nearest road access, deep in prime grizzly habitat. Following standard procedure, Lauren had radioed her position at 6:30 p.m. as required, with her next mandatory check-in scheduled for 8 a.m. the following morning. Late at night, a female grizzly bear with 2 cubs approached Lauren's campsite, likely investigating residual food odors. Evidence at the site, disturbed bear canisters, torn tent fabric, and claw marks, suggested a defensive encounter had occurred. It appeared that Lauren had tried to defend herself, possibly using bear spray, but the wind likely reduced its effectiveness. The bear inflicted severe injuries, including deep lacerations and broken bones, leaving her body near the tent. The grizzly struck Lauren with her right paw, the 4-inch claws raking across her chest and shoulder, tearing through muscle tissue and breaking her collarbone. Lauren fell backward, striking her head against a rock and suffering a severe concussion that disoriented her as the vicious attack continued. The bear bit down on Lauren's left thigh, her powerful jaws crushing the femur bone and severing the femoral artery. Blood loss was immediate and catastrophic, with Lauren losing approximately 40% of her blood volume within the first 4 minutes. The bear continued the assault for another 90 seconds, inflicting deep lacerations to Lauren's abdomen and puncturing her left lung. Lauren lost consciousness due to hypovolemic shock from massive blood loss, dying approximately 3 minutes later from exsanguination as her life drained away in the remote wilderness she had dedicated her career to protecting. When Lauren failed to make her mandatory 8 a.m. radio check-in, a search team was immediately dispatched to her last known location. Rangers found the attack site at 11:45 a.m., discovering clear evidence of the bear encounter and Lauren's body 15 feet from her tent. The female grizzly and her cubs were tracked and relocated to a remote area of the park rather than destroyed, as wildlife officials determined the attack was purely defensive behavior. Investigation revealed Lauren had followed all proper protocols perfectly, but the bear's protective maternal instincts had overridden the deterrent effects of bear spray. The park updated its policies, requiring mandatory 2-person patrols in areas with recent bear activity reports, preventing future rangers from experiencing what Lauren endured. It was September 3rd, 2017, when 41-year-old Chad Ellington, a construction foreman from Los Angeles, embarked on what would become his final desert camping adventure to Anza Borrego Desert State Park. Standing 6 feet 2 inches, with a muscular build earned through years of demanding manual labor, Chad was known for his physical strength and practical problem-solving abilities that served him well on construction sites. His personality was notably stubborn and self-reliant, traits that made him an effective foreman, but also led him to dismiss weather warnings as overly cautious, bureaucratic nonsense. Chad had been an experienced desert camper for over a decade, visiting Anza Borrego quarterly to escape the stress and noise of city life while photographing the region's spectacular desert wildflowers. Chad chose to camp in Coyote Canyon during his annual solo camping trip, seeking solitude and the perfect shots of late-season blooms. Weather services had issued flash flood warnings for the entire region due to tropical storm remnants moving northward from Baja California, but Chad's stubborn nature led him to ignore these alerts completely. His campsite was located in what appeared to be a perfectly flat, sandy area, but was actually part of an active alluvial fan system with braided drainage patterns typical of desert washes. Chad set up his tent 150 yards from the main wash channel, failing to recognize the subtle geological signs that indicated this area regularly channeled floodwater during storms. Having camped in similar desert washes before during dry conditions, Chad's past experiences reinforced his belief that September storms were typically brief and localized events that posed no real threat to experienced campers like himself. Late night, intense thunderstorms in the distant Laguna Mountains began dumping 3.2 inches of rain in just 90 minutes over the watershed that fed directly into Coyote Canyon. Chad was inside his tent organizing camera gear when he heard what sounded like distant wind, completely unaware that the sound was actually rushing water and debris racing toward his location. Within minutes, an 8-foot wall of chocolate brown water mixed with boulders and uprooted desert vegetation came surging down the wash at 30 miles per hour. The flash flood struck Chad's campsite with tremendous hydraulic force, instantly flattening his tent and dragging him into the violent torrent before he could react. Chad was swept hundreds of yards rapidly, his body tumbling violently among car-sized boulders and massive desert ironwood logs. The debris-laden water caused a catastrophic blunt force trauma, fracturing his skull, breaking multiple ribs, and crushing his left shoulder as he was repeatedly slammed against rocks. His tent and sleeping bag wrapped around his torso like a straitjacket, preventing him from swimming even during brief moments when he surfaced. Chad aspirated massive amounts of muddy water filled with sand, gravel, and organic debris, completely blocking his airways and preventing any chance of breathing. The relentless flood carried Chad another 1,200 yards through a narrow canyon section where he was repeatedly battered against rock walls. Chad drowned minutes later, his battered body finally lodging against a concrete debris basin where the wash entered flatter terrain. Park rangers discovered Chad's completely obliterated campsite the next morning during post-storm damage assessment of the canyon system. His body was found 1.8 miles downstream by search and rescue teams using all-terrain vehicles to survey the devastated wash. The medical examiner determined death by drowning with massive blunt force trauma from debris impact. Investigation revealed the flash flood had peaked at 12 feet deep and moved over 8,000 tons of sediment and debris through the canyon. Following Chad's tragic death, authorities implemented better warning systems and made it mandatory to close all desert washes when flash flood watches are issued. It was June 14, 2016, when 31-year-old Kristen Holloway, a physical therapist from San Francisco, joined a group climbing expedition to Yosemite Valley that would tragically become her final adventure. With her compact athletic frame at 5 feet 4 inches, honed through 8 years of committed rock climbing, Kristen had earned recognition as an intermediate-level climber who possessed a true love for the sport. Her personality was notably optimistic and trusting, often leading her to rely heavily on others' judgment about climbing conditions and safety assessments, rather than making independent evaluations. This trusting nature, while endearing to her climbing partners, sometimes put her at unnecessary risk in the unforgiving granite environment of Yosemite. Kristen had joined this particular group climbing trip to attempt several challenging multi-pitch routes over a long weekend, hoping to push her technical skills to the next level. The group chose to camp directly in the valley to maximize their precious climbing time and minimize daily travel to the towering rock faces. Following the advice of more experienced climbers in her group, Kristen positioned her tent directly beneath the imposing granite walls of El Capitan, in an area popular with climbers for its convenient proximity to the routes. Recent geological surveys had noted increased rockfall activity throughout the park due to repeated freeze-thaw cycles. But this critical safety information wasn't widely publicized among the climbing community. Kristen had set up her tent in the evening in what appeared to be a perfectly safe zone, approximately 150 feet from the base of the massive cliff face. The location seemed ideal, offering easy access to climbing routes while providing what she believed was adequate distance from any potential rockfall danger. In the early morning hours, thermal expansion from the previous day's intense heat caused a critical stress fracture to develop in a granite slab positioned 800 feet above the valley floor. The initial crack propagated rapidly through the rock face, destabilizing a massive 2,000-pound granite block measuring 4 feet by 6 feet. Kristen was awakened by a sharp cracking sound echoing through the valley, but couldn't identify its source. In the pre-dawn darkness, moments later, the massive granite block broke free from the cliff face and began its deadly descent, accelerating rapidly due to gravity's relentless pull. The rock struck a protruding ledge 400 feet down, fragmenting into 3 large pieces that continued falling at different trajectories toward the valley floor. The largest fragment, weighing approximately 800 pounds, struck the ground just 12 feet from Kristen's tent. The tremendous impact created a powerful shockwave that knocked Kristen from her sleeping bag and caused her tent to collapse partially around her. A second fragment, weighing 600 pounds, bounced violently off the first impact point and struck Kristen's tent directly with devastating force. The massive rock crushed through the tent fabric like paper and struck Kristen across her torso, instantly fracturing her spine at the T12 vertebra. The enormous weight compressed her chest cavity completely, crushing her ribs and causing immediate catastrophic internal bleeding from severe organ damage. Other campers were awakened by the thunderous impact and immediately called for emergency assistance. Park rangers and medical personnel arrived within minutes, but could only confirm Kristen's death at the scene. It required specialized equipment and 6 rescue personnel to lift the granite fragment off Kristen's body for recovery. In response to the tragic incident, camping policies were revised to ban overnight camping within 200 feet of cliff faces in areas marked as high risk for rockfall. It was July 28, 2015, when 45-year-old Eli Patterson, an insurance adjuster from Pasadena, embarked on what would become his final camping trip to Angeles National Forest. Standing 5 feet 10 inches with an average build typical of someone who spent most days behind a desk, Eli was known for his analytical mind and methodical approach to problem solving that served him well in his demanding career. His personality was naturally cautious and rule-following, traits that made him excellent at his job evaluating insurance claims. However, Eli sometimes became paralyzed by overthinking during crisis situations, a characteristic that would prove fatal in the wilderness. As a weekend warrior, he enjoyed solo camping as essential stress relief from his high-pressure work environment. After a particularly stressful period handling wildfire insurance claims, Eli desperately needed to escape the summer heat and constant city noise. He chose a remote campsite in Angeles National Forest, located 2.8 miles from the nearest road access and connected only by a narrow hiking trail winding through dense chaparral vegetation. Fire danger was rated as extreme throughout the region due to severe drought conditions. But Eli believed his campsite near a small creek would provide adequate protection from any potential fire threat. Following his standard safety protocol for solo trips, Eli informed his brother of his exact location and planned return date before departing. He set up camp late in the afternoon on Saturday, noting the bone-dry conditions, but feeling secure due to the nearby water source and cleared area surrounding his tent. The following day, an illegal campfire 4 miles away escaped containment and rapidly spread through drought-stressed vegetation. Driven by powerful Santa Ana winds reaching 35 miles per hour, the fire advanced at 3 miles per hour through the dense chaparral, heading directly toward Eli's remote location. Eli first noticed smoke in the early afternoon, but initially dismissed it as a distant, controlled burn he had heard mentioned on park radio broadcasts. As time passed, the smoke thickened considerably, and he could see orange flames glowing through the trees, prompting him to pack his gear quickly. He began hiking toward the trailhead, but the narrow trail soon became completely choked with thick smoke, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. His analytical mind, usually a valuable asset, now worked against him as he second-guessed every decision. The fire reached Eli's abandoned campsite shortly after he departed, with flames towering 40 feet high and temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Disoriented in the dense smoke, Eli made a fatal wrong turn, heading deeper into the forest instead of toward safety. As the afternoon progressed, he found himself surrounded by advancing flames on 3 sides. With the fire moving faster than he could navigate through the rugged terrain, Eli sought shelter behind a large boulder, but radiant heat from the approaching inferno caused severe burns to his exposed skin. Superheated air and toxic smoke inflicted devastating respiratory burns, while carbon monoxide poisoning clouded his judgment. He lost consciousness as the fire swept directly over his location. Eli died from smoke inhalation and severe thermal injuries as the flames engulfed the area. Firefighters discovered Eli's remains 2 days later during post-fire damage assessment operations. His body was found 0.6 miles from the correct trail, confirming he had become lost in the smoke and panic. The medical examiner determined death by smoke inhalation, with severe thermal burns covering 60% of his body. Eli's tragic passing catalyzed improvements to evacuation procedures and emergency communication systems in remote forest areas. It was September 12, 2015, when 45-year-old Nash Smith, a research botanist for the University of Washington, embarked on what would become his final collecting expedition to Olympic National Forest. Standing 5 feet 10 inches with a slender build typical of an academic researcher, Nash was known for his extensive knowledge of Pacific Northwest flora and his confident intellectual approach to fieldwork. His personality was notably self-assured and scholarly, sometimes leading him to overestimate his expertise in areas outside his primary specialization. While Nash possessed a PhD in plant biology and decades of experience with edible plants, his knowledge of fungi identification was surprisingly limited despite his academic credentials. Nash planned a solo 3-day camping trip to the remote Hoh River Valley to collect plant specimens for his research on old-growth forest ecosystems. The area was renowned for its diverse mushroom populations, and Nash decided to supplement his camping meals with foraged fungi, confident that his general botanical knowledge would transfer to mushroom identification. His campsite was positioned 3.5 miles from the nearest ranger station, deep in the temperate rainforest environment. Nash carried basic field guides, but relied primarily on his academic training to identify what he believed would be obviously edible species. On Saturday morning, Nash discovered a cluster of pristine white mushrooms with broad caps growing near fallen logs in the damp forest understory. The mushrooms appeared perfect for harvesting, with their clean white appearance and substantial size making them seem like an ideal addition to his planned lunch. Nash fatally misidentified the deadly destroying angel mushrooms, scientifically known as Amanita bisporigera, as harmless oyster mushrooms due to their superficially similar white appearance and broad caps. His academic confidence prevented him from consulting his field guides more carefully. Around midday, Nash cooked and consumed approximately 4 ounces of the poisonous mushrooms as part of his lunch, completely unaware that he had just ingested some of the most lethal toxins found in nature. The amatoxins in the mushrooms immediately began attacking his liver and kidney cells, though symptoms wouldn't manifest for several hours. By evening, Nash experienced the first phase of amatoxin poisoning with severe nausea, explosive vomiting, and violent diarrhea that continued relentlessly through the night. He lost approximately 3 liters of vital fluids, leading to dangerous dehydration and critical electrolyte imbalances. Sunday morning brought a deceptive recovery period where symptoms temporarily subsided, convincing Nash that he had simply experienced food poisoning that was resolving naturally. This false improvement is characteristic of amatoxin poisoning and often prevents victims from seeking emergency medical attention. By Sunday afternoon, the second devastating phase began as amatoxins caused massive liver cell death and acute hepatic failure. Nash developed excruciating abdominal pain, yellowing jaundice, and severe confusion as deadly toxins accumulated in his bloodstream. As Monday dawned, he was in complete liver failure with kidney shutdown, slipping into a hepatic coma as his organs systematically failed. Nash died later that morning from multi-organ failure caused by amatoxin poisoning, alone in his tent deep in the forest. Park rangers discovered Nash's campsite several days later after he failed to return his rental car as scheduled. His body was found in his tent along with the remaining cooked mushrooms. Toxicological analysis and post-mortem examination of his liver and kidneys confirmed death by amatoxin poisoning, showing massive cellular destruction. Investigators reconstructed the timeline of his symptoms and ingestion based on this evidence. His death led to enhanced educational programs about the extreme dangers of amateur mushroom foraging in national forest areas. It was March 22, 2017, at a theme park near Yamanashi, Japan. The air was still cool, and the sun had barely started to rise over the snow-tipped mountains in the distance. Inside the park, the first workers of the day moved in steady patterns, carrying tool bags, testing switches, and checking gates before visitors arrived. The ride stood quiet and empty, their massive steel tracks and support beams stretching high into the pale morning sky. Among the crew was Kenji Sato, age 42, a maintenance worker who had been with the park for nearly 15 years. He was known for being thorough and always checking bolts and track joints by hand, pressing his fingers along metal seams to feel for the smallest looseness. This morning, he followed the same routine, moving through the restricted service zone with a small flashlight tucked beneath his arm. His reflective vest caught bits of the dim light as he stepped carefully under the structure of the park's main roller coaster. At around 6:40 in the morning, Kenji crouched in the trench beneath one section of the elevated track. He leaned close to inspect a joint, tapping it with a wrench and shining his light along the seam. At the same time, in the operator's booth, another team was preparing for the day's test run. These early test runs were routine, meant to confirm that the trains moved smoothly before the first guests were allowed on. Communication lines were open, but in the half-dark of early morning, Kenji's position beneath the track was not visible from the booth. Several co-workers standing near the platform later said they caught a glimpse of his reflective vest between the beams. One of them called out, but the test had already been set in motion. The train's brakes released, and the cars began to roll forward with a metallic clatter. The sound grew louder as the train picked up speed, the wheels grinding along the rails toward the section where Kenji was crouched. By the time he turned his head upward, the cars were almost on top of him, and the train gathered enough force to strike him head-on and throw his body against the concrete trench wall. Witnesses described hearing a heavy impact that sent a jolt through the trench, the sound carrying beneath the track as the weight of the cars thundered overhead. A co-worker shouted, but the train could not be stopped in time. The cars continued along the circuit, the rest of the crew frozen in shock as the noise faded into the distance. When the train rolled to a halt, the ride sat in eerie silence. The operator cut power, leaving the cars suspended in place on the track above. Workers rushed into the restricted zone, but there was nothing left to do. The trench where Kenji had been crouching was now quiet, only the faint hum of the ride's machinery still audible. For several minutes, no one spoke. The crew stood in disbelief, staring at the stopped train and the empty seats. The sounds of the park, the usual chatter of radios, the clank of tools, the hum of generators, had gone still. By late morning, the decision was made to close the entire park. Gates that had been prepared to welcome visitors were quietly shut. Tourists arriving from buses were turned away without explanation, watching from the parking lot as the rides loomed in silence behind the fences. Inside, security staff sealed off the roller coaster and the surrounding pathways. By noon, the park stood empty, the sounds of laughter and movement replaced with the stillness of steel tracks against the mountain air. It was October 6th, 2014, at a medical center in Manhattan. The imaging department was working through a crowded schedule, with late appointments pushing into the evening. The hallways carried the usual hospital sounds: footsteps on tile, rolling carts, and the beeping of machines. In the MRI wing, technicians prepared the scanning room for the next patient. The large machine dominated the space, its bore open like a tunnel waiting for the next person to be slid inside. Among the staff was Angela Ramsey, 29 years old, a nurse's aide. She had joined the hospital a year earlier and often covered multiple support roles. That afternoon, she was helping the imaging staff with patient preparation. Angela's job was simple: guide the patient in, check the safety checklist, and bring in whatever support equipment was needed. On this day, the patient assigned to her required a portable oxygen tank. These tanks were heavy, steel cylinders fitted with gauges and a valve at the top. They were not supposed to enter the MRI room because the magnetic field could pull them in. But according to co-workers, the tank was rolled in without being flagged, a mistake that bypassed the usual safety check. Around 7:15 in the evening, Angela walked into the scanning room, holding onto the cylinder. The patient remained outside in the prep area, waiting for the machine to be cleared. A technician was at the control station, adjusting settings, while another staff member looked through paperwork. Eyewitnesses later described what happened as almost instant. The moment the tank crossed the threshold of the room, the powerful magnet seized it. The cylinder ripped free from Angela's hands, as though yanked by an invisible rope. Workers nearby said it shot forward so fast that there was no time to react. The heavy tank slammed across the room in a blur of steel. In less than a second, it pinned Angela against the side of the MRI bore with crushing force. The sound of metal striking metal rang through the chamber, followed by shouts from the startled technicians. One staff member lunged for the emergency shutoff, but the magnet held at full strength. The tank stayed fused to the bore, pressed hard against the machine with Angela trapped between. Those in the room later recalled the noise of the gauges rattling on the tank and the steady hum of the magnet still powering the scanner. Technicians tried pulling at the tank, but the pull of the field was far too strong. Angela's body slumped under the weight, and the cylinder stayed fused against the machine like it had been welded there. From the hallway outside, patients waiting for their scans heard shouting and the sudden thud of equipment. Staff quickly moved them back into the lobby. Orderlies shut the double doors and placed tape across the entryway to keep anyone from walking in. The imaging wing grew quiet, except for the muffled hum of the magnet still running inside the sealed room. Within an hour, the corridor was empty, sealed off with security standing by. The only sound was the ventilation system pushing cool air through the deserted hallway. Behind the closed door, the MRI sat silent, except for its constant low vibration. By late evening, the entire wing was cordoned off. Security staff redirected anyone who approached, offering no explanations. The hospital floors above remained active with their normal traffic, but the MRI unit below stayed dark. Inside the chamber, the machine and the oxygen tank remained locked together, an immovable reminder of what had taken place just hours earlier. It was January 4th, 2019. At a hotel in Dubai, the main kitchen was at full pace, preparing for a banquet dinner that evening. The event was important. A visiting trade delegation had reserved one of the hotel's ballrooms, and the staff had been working since the morning to keep everything on schedule. Stainless steel counters were lined with trays of vegetables, fish, and meats. Saucepans steamed on burners, and the constant noise of knives on cutting boards mixed with the clatter of dishes being stacked and carried away. Among the staff was Farid Hassan, 38 years old, a sous chef with 2 decades of kitchen experience. He had been working in hotels and restaurants since the age of 17. That afternoon, he was stationed near the hotline, making sure prep stations were clean and ingredients stayed organized. At one point, he crouched near the grease trap beneath the grated floor, where oils and runoff collected. A co-worker nearby later recalled that Farid was chatting casually about their children as he worked, his hands moving through a routine he had done countless times. By 6:30 in the evening, the kitchen was at its busiest. Multiple burners ran at once, deep fryers bubbled, and waiters hurried in and out to pick up trays. The heat inside the room was thick, and the air carried the smell of frying oil and roasted meat. It was during this rush that a small spill of oil leaked through the grate, dripping into the trap below. Farid bent down with a flashlight to check, intending to wipe the mess before it spread further. At that moment, a flame from one of the nearby gas stoves made contact with the vapors rising from the oil. Witnesses said it happened almost instantly. A muffled whoomph echoed through the space, and a wall of fire exploded upward out of the pit. The flames shot toward the ceiling, catching the grease that had built up in the narrow space around the trap. The fire engulfed the space where Farid was crouched. Co-workers shouted as the flash of light filled the room, followed by the smell of burning oil. Some staff grabbed wet towels and tried to smother the flames, but the fire spread too fast. The ceiling vents above the cooking line quickly caught, and flames moved through the air ducts, pulling smoke across the kitchen. Automatic suppression nozzles discharged above the fryers, but the flash fire had already moved beyond their range. Within seconds, alarms triggered. A shrill siren rang through the kitchen and into the dining hall, startling waiters carrying trays toward the banquet doors. Smoke spread in thick layers, blurring the counters and turning the air gray. Staff scrambled for fire extinguishers, while others tried to guide workers toward the service exit. One dishwasher later described seeing sparks shoot across the ceiling before the lights dimmed under the smoke. By the time responders reached the lower level, most of the flames had burned out on their own, leaving scorched metal and shattered glass across the line. In the corner near the grate, they found Farid collapsed beside the grease trap. His reflective apron burned through. He had been only a few feet from the fire door, but never made it out. When the smoke finally cleared, the kitchen was silent. Steam rose from the soaked floors where sprinklers had run dry. Utensils, trays, and burned vegetables lay scattered under a haze that smelled of ash and oil. Farid's station, the one he had kept spotless for years, was barely recognizable. Outside, the dining hall reopened days later, but the lower kitchen never did. For those who had worked beside him, the space stayed frozen in memory, one quiet corner of a busy hotel that no one returned to. It was June 12, 2015, in Quezon City, Philippines. The church compound was quiet at that hour, but inside the candle factory, the work continued. Orders had doubled ahead of the annual festival, and the staff had been told to push through the night to meet demand. The building itself was simple: concrete walls, wooden beams overhead, and long work tables lined with tubs of melted wax. Rows of molds cooled near the windows, stacked waist-high and giving off the faint scent of paraffin. Around 24 workers moved between tables, dipping wicks, pouring wax, and trimming cooled batches. The sound of scraping metal molds and splashing wax filled the air, mixing with the steady hum of fans pushing warm air toward the doors. Despite the hour, the heat in the room was heavy, the floors slick with stray drips of hardened wax. Among the group was Marites Alonzo, 47 years old, known by the others as the batch leader. She had worked there for more than 10 years and often showed the younger workers how to pour and dip properly. On this night, she moved between groups, checking molds and reminding workers to keep the floor clear of spills. Witnesses later recalled seeing her with a rag tucked in her apron pocket, using it to wipe stray drips as she walked. At 1:15 in the morning, a container filled with melted paraffin was accidentally knocked from one of the tables. The hot liquid poured across the floor, spreading quickly in a thin sheet. Several workers shouted as it touched a patch of heat near the burners. In an instant, flames flashed upward, racing across the spill. Eyewitnesses said the fire leapt from tub to tub, igniting other containers like a chain reaction. The workers closest to the door bolted, while others grabbed tools or cloths to try and put out the flames. One man later told investigators the fire spread so fast, the wooden beams overhead began to blacken and shed embers as the fire spread. The air grew thick, carrying the sharp smell of burning wax. Marites was seen near the back of the factory, trying to guide younger staff toward the rear exit. But the fire had already reached that corner. Flames curled up the door frame, sealing off the only path out. Windows along the wall cracked under the heat, glass shattering outward into the courtyard. Smoke poured through the gaps, spilling into the compound. Neighbors living beside the church compound said they woke to the sound of shouts and breaking glass. From the street, they saw smoke rising through the dark sky, the glow of fire visible through the factory's high windows. Some ran to the gates, but the heat kept them back. They later recalled the sound of timber snapping as the roof beams gave way. Inside, the blaze consumed the rows of molds and tubs, turning them into fuel. The workers who escaped said they barely made it out through the side doors near the supply storage, their clothes marked with soot. Others had tried the main exit, but were forced back by flames and smoke so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. When the fire was finally out, responders searched the ruins. Marites was discovered near the rear exit, collapsed at the frame she had tried to reach, only feet from the way out. By morning, the smoke had settled over the compound, the smell of wax and ash lingering in the air long after the fire was gone. Authorities later sealed off the site for inspection, but the damage had already erased most traces of how it began. It was September 17, 2015. at a county medical examiner's facility outside Chicago. The morgue was busy, even at night, with staff moving between storage rooms and logging case numbers into ledgers. The facility handled hundreds of bodies each month, and inventory checks were part of the routine to keep cases organized. Long hallways connected the autopsy rooms to the storage wing, where several large walk-in freezers held rows of gurneys stacked with covered remains. Among the night staff was Thomas Grady, 56 years old, a morgue attendant with more than 30 years in the job. He had worked nights for most of his career and was known for humming jazz tunes as he wrote in his logbook. Colleagues recalled that he never rushed his work, often double-checking tags before marking them down. That night, his task was to confirm identification numbers in the west freezer. Carrying a clipboard and pen, he stepped inside around 11:15 p.m. The freezer was large, cold, and brightly lit, its temperature set to about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Shelves of gurneys filled the space, each one tagged with a paper slip tied to the wrist or ankle of the covered remains. Thomas walked steadily between them, his pen moving across the page as he checked numbers against his list. The steady hum of the refrigeration fans filled the room. Minutes after he entered, the heavy steel door swung shut. The latch clicked, sealing tight. From the outside, no one noticed. In the adjoining workroom, two attendants were busy sorting files. Later, they admitted they heard faint thuds, but assumed it was trays shifting or equipment being rolled. The insulated walls muffled nearly all sound from inside. Thomas continued his work at first, finishing several lines in the log. At some point, he realized the door wouldn't budge. The freezer's design only allowed it to be opened from the outside, and there was no alarm or emergency release in that unit. That particular model had been in service since the 1980s, one of the few that hadn't yet been refitted with an internal latch or safety alarm. His clipboard was left on a lower shelf when he paused, the pen resting across the page mid-sentence. By midnight, the cold had begun to seep deeper into the room. The metal shelving felt colder than the air itself, the chill biting through his gloves as he worked. He'd been on shift since noon, his body running on stale coffee and habit. He moved slower now, his hands stiff, his thoughts clouding as the chill settled through his clothes. At 2 a.m., the rest of the staff finished their assignments. One by one, they clocked out and left the building, assuming Thomas had already gone. The corridor outside the storage wing fell silent. Inside the chamber, the air stayed bright and faintly circulating, the low mechanical hum masking every sound. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The cold drew tighter around him, his movements slowing until they stopped entirely. Sometime before dawn, Thomas collapsed beside the shelving, the cold overtaking him long before anyone returned. At 6:45 a.m., the morning shift arrived. A younger attendant was sent to retrieve a body scheduled for release paperwork. He opened the freezer door and immediately saw Thomas lying on the floor near the shelving unit, his skin pale and his posture rigid. The clipboard was still on the rack above him, the final entry left unfinished. The workers shouted for help, and others rushed to the doorway. Supervisors moved in quickly, ordering the freezer sealed while emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but confirmed he had already been dead for several hours. He had died from hypothermia sometime before dawn. By late morning, the west freezer was closed off, and all storage was rerouted to another wing. Staff avoided the corridor where he had been found, the doorway taped shut while repairs were arranged. The incident later led to safety upgrades, adding internal release latches to all remaining storage units. On the counter outside, his logbook and pen remained untouched, the last line of handwriting trailing off without completion. It was April 9, 2016, at a private antiquities museum on the outskirts of Cairo. The sun had started heating the sandstone walls, and the air inside was still cool from the night before. Workers moved between rows of crates and stone fragments spread across 3 galleries and a restoration wing. The building was not large, but it held several artifacts recently moved from government storage facilities across the city. Among the newest arrivals was a granite sarcophagus, its lid weighing well over a ton. The staff had been preparing it for a new display scheduled to open later that month. Youssef Khalil was 34 and part of the small handling team assigned to move the heavy lid. He grew up in a neighborhood near Giza, and studied history in college before taking the museum job 5 years earlier. He liked being around history, even if the work was mostly physical. The pay was steady and the hours were predictable. That morning, the team gathered in the lower gallery where the exhibit was being set up. Temporary scaffolding lined the walls and tools sat in open cases near the entrance. A steel winch stood anchored to the floor near the sarcophagus, its hook hanging at chest height. The lid had been placed in a wooden crate for transport, secured by heavy chains that connected to the winch. The plan was to lift it, move the base into position, then lower it carefully onto a reinforced pedestal built specifically for the display. Youssef arrived early that day, as he usually did. He checked the straps and made sure the chains were properly attached, while the others tested the hoist controls. The work was routine but required careful coordination. The team had handled smaller artifacts before, but this was the heaviest piece they had moved in months. The museum director had reminded them twice to take their time and follow procedures exactly. No shortcuts, no rushing. The morning moved slowly. Workers swept the floor around the installation area and adjusted the pedestal to the correct height. By 10:30 a.m., everything was ready. The winch motor hummed when they powered it on. The chain pulled tight and the granite slab began to rise slowly from its wooden base. Workers positioned themselves at the corners of the crate, hands ready to steady it as the lid lifted. The steel links creaked under the weight. Dust drifted down from the ceiling rafters as the machine took on the full load. The slab hovered several inches above the floor, swaying slightly. Witnesses later told investigators the chain snapped without any warning. The sound was sharp and metallic. The slab dropped straight down before anyone could react. Youssef had been standing near the corner, one hand reaching out to guide the crate as it swung. The granite struck him directly before he could step back. The impact threw him to the floor beneath the weight. The thud echoed through the gallery. One worker stumbled backward, hands still raised from holding the guide rope. Another shouted for help. Then 2 men rushed forward and grabbed at the broken chain still hanging from the hoist above. They tried to lift the granite slab, but it barely shifted under their combined effort. Someone ran to the wall to cut power to the winch, while others pulled phones from their pockets and called for security. The building had no central emergency system, no alarm to trigger, just individual radios and mobile phones. Within minutes, supervisors arrived from the restoration wing on the far side of the building. They radioed for paramedics and ordered everyone to block the hallway leading to the gallery. The small staff gathered near the doorway. The floor beneath the wooden crate was cracked in a wide spiderweb pattern where the slab had fallen. When emergency crews reached the site nearly 20 minutes later, they brought hydraulic air jacks from their truck. They positioned the jacks carefully and raised the granite just enough to pull Youssef free from underneath. There was nothing they could do. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was listed as massive blunt trauma to the chest and head. Work stopped immediately across the entire museum. The lights in the lower gallery were switched off and the machinery powered down. The sound of the winch motor cooling was the only noise in the space. Staff were sent home for the rest of the day. Outside, tourists waiting for afternoon tours were told the exhibit was delayed due to a technical issue. Within the hour, the gates locked and police cordoned off the loading area. That evening, the museum released a statement citing an equipment malfunction during installation. Authorities conducted a brief safety inspection before the site reopened a week later. The sarcophagus exhibit was never completed. The artifact was quietly returned to storage. It was May 19, 2018, in the Mount Hood National Forest of Oregon. The air was mild, the sky clear, and the forest alive with spring growth. On the Hunchback Trail, hikers moved between shaded pines and open overlooks, enjoying one of the region's most popular routes. Yet beyond the marked path, predators still patrolled these woods, and one would not remain unseen for long. Claire Hounder, 34, lived in Salem and worked as a dental hygienist. Known for her steady manner with patients, she carried the stress of long shifts quietly. Hiking had become her way to reset. After work, she often drove to nearby trails, preferring the rhythm of steady movement in solitude. Friends and co-workers described her as cautious in daily life, but less attentive outdoors. usually carrying little more than water. She was not drawn to risk, but believed that familiar, well-traveled trails were safe. She had no sponsors or obligations. The hikes were personal, a way to balance routine with open space. The Hunchback Trail begins near Zigzag and climbs steeply before leveling along ridges with views toward Mount Hood. Though popular, the trail winds through dense forest where sightlines are short, and wildlife occasionally crosses paths with hikers. Mountain lions inhabit the region, elusive but capable of ambushing from cover. Standard advice for hikers includes carrying deterrents, avoiding earbuds, and traveling in groups. Attacks are rare, but when they occur, they unfold with sudden violence. On that Saturday, Claire signed into the trail register in the late morning, writing only her name. She set out at a steady pace, earbuds in, her water bottle strapped to her pack. Other hikers later recalled passing her as she climbed, moving alone, but not hurried. A couple ahead on the trail noticed her presence behind them at intervals, closing the gap slightly before pausing again. None of them saw the shadow that began to track her from the dense brush to the side. Several hikers reported hearing birds scatter suddenly, followed by silence. The couple in front remembered a sharp, human shriek breaking the quiet. When they turned, the scene was already in motion. A tawny mountain lion had leapt onto Claire from behind, its jaws locked onto her shoulders. She screamed and thrashed, her arms clawing at the dirt as the animal's weight forced her down. Her earbuds had been torn free, the cord dragging through the mud. The couple froze briefly before one of them grabbed rocks from the trail and hurled them toward the attack. The lion ignored the first strikes, tightening its grip as Claire kicked and tried to rise. Her movements weakened as the cat shifted its bite toward her neck, dragging her sideways toward the slope. The man threw again, one rock striking the lion's flank, but the animal did not release. With a sudden pull, it dragged her downslope into the brush, her cries cutting off seconds later. The forest returned to silence, but for the sound of running feet as hikers rushed to alert others. Rangers responding to emergency calls reached the site within the hour. They located her body about 20 yards downstream, concealed among ferns and broken branches. The injuries were consistent with predation, with clear bite marks along her neck and shoulders. Tracks surrounding the scene confirmed a single adult lion. The recovery team secured the area and escorted shaken hikers back to the trailhead. Claire's funeral was held in Salem, where co-workers, patients, and friends attended. Her dental clinic closed for the day in her memory. She was remembered for her calm patience with children and her quiet strength outside of work. Wildlife officials tracked the lion using dogs and motion cameras, locating it within 48 hours. The animal was euthanized, and new warnings were issued across the state's trail networks. Authorities emphasized the importance of hiking in groups, avoiding earbuds, and carrying deterrents in known lion habitats. It was July 22, 2017, in Death Valley National Park, California. By late morning, the desert floor shimmered under 115-degree heat, the air heavy and still. On the Golden Canyon Trail, a lone figure moved farther from the parking lot, determined to press on despite conditions that had already sent others back. Jenna Mendez, 27, worked as a graphic designer in Las Vegas. She was independent, stubbornly so, often taking unplanned road trips across the desert. Friends described her as someone who sought open spaces when work became overwhelming. She was not reckless in daily life, but she resisted being told what she could or could not do. Hiking in the desert appealed to her sense of self-sufficiency. Without sponsors or obligations, she had no outside pressures. Her challenges were personal, often framed as quiet tests of endurance. The Golden Canyon Trail is a popular route, winding through exposed rock formations with little shade. In summer, it becomes especially hazardous, with reflective walls trapping heat and raising ground-level temperatures well above the official readings. Rangers routinely warn against midday hikes during peak season, urging visitors to carry multiple liters of water and to start before sunrise. Jenna carried only a half-full bottle and no extra gear. Her clothing was light, but it offered little protection against relentless sun exposure. That morning, Tourists leaving the canyon recalled seeing her begin the hike as others turned back. She walked with purpose, head high. Early along the trail, several hikers noted her flushed skin, but thought she seemed determined to continue. By late morning, a Belgian couple began the same route behind her. They saw her ahead, slowing on the incline as the path narrowed. As the couple gained ground, they saw her stumble, catching herself briefly before dropping to one knee. When they reached her, her face was red, her lips cracked. She insisted she was fine and waved them off, though her words were slurred. They offered her water, which she sipped weakly before standing again. She walked a few more yards, but her steps were unsteady. Moments later, she collapsed fully. Convulsions shook her limbs, her hands clawing briefly before going rigid. The couple knelt beside her, noting her skin was hot and dry rather than damp. They shaded her with a jacket and attempted to pour water onto her lips, but she was barely responsive. Her breathing became shallow, then ragged. As they dialed emergency services, she stopped moving, her chest rising only faintly. CPR was begun, compressions echoing in the silence of the canyon. Rangers arrived 20 minutes later, carrying medical gear. They recorded her body temperature as dangerously high, her pulse weak and irregular. Despite continued resuscitation attempts, she did not recover. She was declared dead on sight from heat stroke. Her remains transported back across the shimmering flats to Furnace Creek. Her funeral was held in Reno, where her parents lived. The service was small, attended by relatives and a handful of co-workers who remembered her for her quiet creativity and independence. Following her death, park officials added stronger warnings at trailheads, stressing the dangers of solo hiking during extreme temperatures. Signs in multiple languages urged visitors to avoid midday travel and to carry more water than they believed necessary. Rangers began patrolling popular trails more aggressively during heat advisories, encouraging early turnarounds before conditions became fatal. It was August 14th, 2015, in the Dolomites of northern Italy. The sky was mostly clear, but high ridges carried a restless wind that sent occasional dust and loose stones skittering down slopes. The cliffs above the Bochet route held their usual silence, but the stability of their walls was never guaranteed. For those on the trail that morning, the beauty of the jagged towers came with risks that could shift in seconds. Anna Lang, 39, was a schoolteacher from Munich, spending her summer holiday in the Alps. She had always gravitated to mountains for their solitude and clarity, preferring to hike alone rather than in groups. Her friends and colleagues described her as careful and disciplined, someone who prepared well for her outings, but occasionally underestimated alpine hazards. For her, these trips were not athletic challenges, but ways to decompress from long school terms. Risk was not something she sought deliberately, though she accepted it as part of reaching the high landscapes she loved. The Bochet route is via Ferrata, a protected climbing path common in the Dolomites. Steel cables and ladders allow hikers to traverse exposed cliffs with harnesses and carabiners. The system offers security against falls, but it does not protect against rockfall from above. Helmets are standard, and experienced climbers know not to linger beneath steep faces where debris can loosen. In late summer, freeze-thaw cycles and occasional storms leave cliffs unstable, and small dislodged stones are often precursors to larger collapses. That morning, Anna signed into the route and began moving steadily along the cables. Witnesses later noted she had the correct gear and clipped carefully, though she moved at a cautious pace. A Swiss group several minutes behind her observed that she paused often under high walls, looking out across the valleys rather than advancing quickly through exposed sections. They were aware of occasional trickles of gravel overhead, but continued, judging the conditions normal for August. As the route gained height, the trail narrowed to a traverse beneath a vertical face. The Swiss hikers saw her hesitate midway across, adjusting her carabiners with deliberate care. A sudden crack echoed above, sharp and unnatural. They looked upward to see a section of fractured rock beginning to shear off the cliff. Dust clouded instantly, and smaller fragments rained down ahead of the main fall. They shouted for her to move, but Anna looked up at the noise instead. A block the size of a backpack split loose, bouncing before striking her on the left shoulder. The blow spun her sideways off her stance. Though clipped to the cable, the force of the impact wrenched her body outward, slamming her against the wall. Her helmet shifted, and the harness straps twisted as she struck the cliff multiple times. Within seconds, her tether failed under extreme force. She tumbled out of sight, vanishing into the scree slope hundreds of feet below. The Swiss group froze, then scrambled to a safe alcove. Dust still drifted in the air, and fresh scars marked the rock face where the block had torn free. They could see her motionless form far below, sprawled on unstable stone. Attempts to descend were impossible on the steep terrain, so they alerted rescuers by phone. When Alpine Rescue reached the slope hours later, they confirmed fatal injuries from both the initial impact and the subsequent fall. Her funeral was held in Munich, where colleagues and students filled the church with flowers and notes of remembrance. Many spoke of her patience in the classroom and her love of mountain holidays that she often described to her pupils. Italian authorities closed the Bocquet route for inspection. Engineers examined unstable sections and cleared debris before reopening several weeks later. Additional warnings were added at trailheads, reminding hikers not to pause beneath steep walls and to treat late summer conditions with heightened caution. It was March 12, 2016, at the cliffs of Moher in Western Ireland. The weather alternated between sun and mist, and sharp gusts swept in from the Atlantic. Tour buses unloaded visitors throughout the morning, but the edges of the cliffs remained exposed and unpredictable. The day would end in silence and shock when one step too close met the weakness of crumbling ground. Rachel Parrish, 22, was a university student from Cork studying media and communications. Friends described her as outgoing, eager to document her life in photos and share them with classmates. She often sought dramatic scenery, combining her interest in photography with weekend trips to Ireland's coasts. She was ambitious and sometimes impulsive, driven by a desire to capture images that felt larger than her routine life. Risk was not her focus, but she was known to take chances with positioning herself close to edges to get the shot she wanted. The cliffs of Moher are among the most visited natural sights in Ireland, rising over 700 feet above the Atlantic. The terrain is composed of layered shale and sandstone, subject to erosion from constant wind and rain. While sections are fenced, many areas remain open, with grass leading right to unstable ledges. On that morning, Rachel arrived carrying her phone and a small tripod. Witnesses later noted that she set up shots near the paths, but gradually edged closer to unprotected ground. The wind was strong enough to force people to brace themselves, yet she appeared intent on capturing the sea backdrop behind her. Several tourists saw her crouch and adjust her phone, stepping back toward the drop as she aligned herself in the frame. Conditions grew more hazardous as sudden gusts swept over the rim. A pair of German tourists walking nearby noticed Rachel positioning herself near an overhang of damp turf. They hesitated, sensing the danger, but she seemed focused on her device. Others passed quickly, choosing not to linger near the edge in the shifting wind. Without warning, the ground beneath her gave way. The grass and soil split with a muffled crack, and a section of the ledge separated from the main cliff. Rachel let out a piercing scream as the earth dropped beneath her feet. Her body pitched forward into open space, falling hundreds of feet straight into the waves below. The German couple shouted for help, drawing attention from nearby visitors. People rushed to the area, some peering over the rim, but the distance and ocean swell made rescue impossible. Emergency services were called immediately, and the area was cordoned off while Coast Guard helicopters searched below. Recovery efforts were delayed by rough seas, with her body located later that evening. Her funeral in Cork was held quietly, attended by classmates, family, and neighbors, in disbelief at the sudden loss. Irish authorities reviewed the incident in their safety reports and installed additional barriers and warning signs in popular sections of the cliffs. They emphasized that unstable ground made it impossible to guarantee safety near edges, urging visitors to remain on established paths. It was October 21st, 2017, in Banff National Park, Alberta. The morning began with scattered clouds and crisp autumn air, drawing dozens of hikers to the popular trails. By midday, a wall of weather from the west would transform the landscape, turning open paths into whiteout conditions, eventually cutting a life short. Marie Dangle, 30 years old, was a French exchange student living in Calgary. She was studying environmental science and drawn to the Canadian Rockies, both for research and personal escape. Friends described her as independent, sometimes to the point of stubbornness, determined to prove she could handle challenges without relying on others. Hiking alone was her habit, and she often posted photos from summits with captions about testing herself. Risk, for her, was not sought recklessly, but accepted as proof of resilience. The Plain of Six Glaciers Trail is a well-known route that begins gently, but climbs into exposed alpine terrain. At higher elevations, the path runs along open slopes where wind can accelerate and snow accumulates quickly. Standard preparation includes insulated layers, waterproof gear, and emergency supplies. But Marie carried only a fleece jacket, a light day pack, and a small amount of food and water. That day, forecasts warned of snow moving in by early afternoon. Many hikers chose shorter routes or turned back early. Marie signed the trail register and proceeded uphill, smiling at others she passed. Witnesses later recalled seeing her at the overlook above Lake Louise, pausing to take in the view even as gray clouds thickened on the horizon. By then, wind gusts carried sleet, and visibility was dropping. As she pressed higher, conditions worsened rapidly. Snow began to fall in heavy sheets, covering the trail and obscuring landmarks. A group descending urged her to head down with them, but she shook her head and continued alone. The decision placed her further into exposure just as the storm arrived in full force. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had plummeted and the path was buried under drifts. A father and his teenage son, retreating quickly down the trail, spotted movement through the blowing snow. It was Marie, crouched low against the wind, her hands bare and trembling. She was shivering violently, her face pale beneath wind-stung skin. She raised an arm weakly toward them before collapsing sideways into the snow. The two rushed over, trying to shield her with their jackets. They attempted to lift her, dragging her in the direction of the tree line, but the blizzard intensified, limiting their progress to a crawl. Marie's movements slowed despite their efforts. Her body became rigid with cold, her breaths shallow and erratic. The father tried to keep her conscious, rubbing her arms and covering her torso with his pack. But within minutes, her eyes closed and her chest stilled. They continued dragging her, hoping for shelter, but she no longer responded. By the time rescuers located them hours later, guided by coordinates relayed through spotty phone reception, she showed no pulse. Her skin had turned bluish, and exposure had claimed her before aid could reach the scene. Her funeral was held in Lyon after her parents arranged for her body to be flown home. Former classmates, professors, and relatives gathered, remembering her as adventurous and determined, her absence leaving a sharp void. Parks Canada issued an incident report, urging hikers to treat October in the Rockies as full winter conditions. Advisories were updated to stress the need for insulated clothing, survival gear, and avoiding solo travel during shifting weather patterns, even on well-known trails. It was June 14, 2015, in South Mountain Park on the southern edge of Phoenix. The sun had dropped low, staining the desert in deep orange light, while shadows stretched across rocky washes. Evening hikers moved quietly through the fading heat, unaware that one of them would soon not return home. Teresa Valdez, 41, worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized Phoenix firm. She balanced long office hours with raising 2 children, carving out time for evening hikes as a way to clear her mind. Friends described her as disciplined and orderly, but hiking was her one indulgence, a place where structure gave way to quiet solitude. She rarely took risks knowingly, but she also did not overthink hazards, assuming her familiarity with the desert meant she could manage them. South Mountain Park is crisscrossed with trails that pass through open desert, washes, and rocky ridges. In June, the terrain remains hot long after sunset, and wildlife becomes more active as temperatures drop. Rattlesnakes, common in the area, often settle among rocks or along washes in the evening. Most hikers wear boots and keep to marked paths, but Teresa had on shorts and running shoes, light clothing better suited for exercise than for protection against hazards. That evening, warnings about snake activity had been posted at several trailheads. Some hikers decided to turn back early after spotting a few rattlers sunning near the rocks. Teresa, however, signed in at the kiosk and pressed forward. She chose a quieter route, turning onto a rocky wash where the trail faded into loose gravel. The path was shaded, cooler than the open ridges, but also more concealed. Other hikers later reported seeing her crouch to tie her shoe, unaware of what lay just beside her foot. As she leaned down, a sharp cry cut the stillness. A family walking nearby turned in time to see Teresa jerk backward, clutching her calf. In the rocks, a coiled rattlesnake struck again, lashing forward with speed. The second bite landed higher on her leg before the snake slipped back between stones. Teresa staggered upright, her face tight with shock, and tried to hobble away from the spot. Within moments, symptoms began to overwhelm her. She broke into heavy sweats despite the cooling air, her skin flushing and then paling. She vomited, fell to one knee, and then collapsed fully onto the gravel. The family rushed to her side, calling emergency services while trying to calm her. They noticed the swelling spread rapidly from the bite upward, her leg ballooning grotesquely. She clutched at her stomach and gasped for air, her lips beginning to discolor. For 20 minutes, they tried to keep her awake, shading her with a jacket and pressing cloth against her forehead. The trail's rough terrain slowed paramedic access, forcing rescuers to approach on foot with equipment. By the time they arrived, Teresa's body had gone limp. Her breathing had stopped, and despite attempts at resuscitation, she showed no response. Rangers later identified bite marks consistent with a western diamondback rattlesnake, the venom likely overwhelming her system before antivenom could be administered. Her funeral in Phoenix drew co-workers, extended family, and dozens of neighbors. Her children attended in tears. Her absence felt most strongly among them. In the weeks following, city officials coordinated with park staff to launch a snake safety awareness campaign. Signs warning about summer snake activity were added at major trailheads, advising hikers to wear protective clothing, remain on established paths, and avoid hiking alone at twilight. It was March 3, 2016, in Helsinki, Finland, and the winter evening was quiet. The streets were damp from melting snow, and neon signs reflected off the wet pavement. In the Kallio district, a small fitness center was closing for the night. Jukka Lehtinen, a 52-year-old gym owner known for strict discipline, had spent decades in the fitness business. He was tough on his staff and often called out their mistakes in front of members. His style was old school and unforgiving. A few weeks earlier, he had a heated clash with one of his trainers, Kari Niemi. During a busy session, Jukka accused him of being careless with equipment and unprofessional with clients. He raised his voice and pointed his finger while members watched from nearby machines. The confrontation embarrassed Kari in front of everyone. His face flushed red as he tore off his staff shirt and walked out. He left the gym that day and told others he would never forgive Jukka for what had happened. Jukka followed the same routine every night, and Kari knew it well. After the last members left, Jukka always ended his shift with a solo sauna session. Same pattern, same time, like clockwork. Kari still had a spare key that he never returned. One evening, he slipped inside after hours. The gym was empty and silent. He moved to the sauna's control box and disabled the automatic shutoff that kept the heat from climbing too high. Then he wedged the outside latch with a metal shim so the door could not be opened from inside. He tested it once to make sure it held. Satisfied, he left quietly through the back exit. The following night, Jukka followed his routine. Around 10 p.m., he walked through the locker room with a towel over his shoulder and stepped into the sauna. A cleaner sweeping the hall noticed him enter. At first, nothing seemed wrong. 10 minutes later, the cleaner walked past again and paused. Thick steam was rolling under the door. From inside came dull thumps, heavy and uneven. The cleaner thought Juka was shifting on the bench or tossing water onto the hot rocks, but the sound sharpened, like fists striking wood. He called out but got no response. The cleaner tugged at the handle, but the latch would not move. It felt jammed tight. Worried, he rushed to the supply closet and grabbed a metal bar used for weight racks. His hands shook as he searched through the shelves. By the time he returned with another staff member, the pounding had stopped. Together, they forced the latch open. The door groaned and then swung outward. A wave of heat surged into the hall, thick and choking. Inside, the benches were soaked. Steam clung to every surface, and the air burned to breathe. Yuka was collapsed on the middle bench, motionless. His skin was flushed a deep red, and his towel was darkened at the edges. Later checks showed the sauna had climbed past 220 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond safe limits. The cleaner backed away in shock. The room was so hot that they could not stand inside for more than a few seconds. What was once a place of calm had turned into a furnace. Investigators arrived later that night. They found the safety timer had been tampered with, and the latch jammed from the outside. It was not a simple malfunction. Someone had prepared the trap. Tool marks on the control box matched wrenches missing from the locker Kari Niemi once used, and his spare key was recovered during a search of his apartment. He was arrested within days, and the case was ruled a calculated act of revenge. The gym closed for a week. Members spoke in hushed voices about the owner who lost his life in the very place he trusted most. It was September 12, 2015, in Tuscany, Italy, and the hillsides were quiet as evening settled. The air was heavy with the smell of grapes during harvest season. On the edge of Chianti country, a small vineyard was prepared for another long night of work. Running this estate was Paolo Ricci, a 61-year-old co-owner who had spent his life building the family business. Paolo was known for his sharp business sense and stubborn decisions. He ran the vineyard with an iron grip and rarely backed down from a fight. Earlier that year, he forced his cousin, Marco Ricci, out of the partnership after a bitter dispute over finances. Paolo claimed Marco had been mismanaging funds and making poor choices that hurt the business. Many workers whispered that Marco had taken the loss hard. For decades, he had labored in the same fields alongside Paolo, only to watch his name removed from contracts and his influence stripped away. He rarely spoke to the family after the split, but people noticed him walking the edge of the vineyard rows more than once, watching in silence from a distance. Marco knew the property better than anyone. He also knew the dangers inside the underground wine cellar. The sealed stone room held fermenting barrels that released carbon dioxide, a gas heavier than air. If trapped inside without proper ventilation, the buildup could suffocate a person within minutes. Marco had helped design the cellar years earlier, and he remembered every latch, every vent, and every corner. That knowledge became the center of his plan for revenge. On a late summer evening, Marco returned to the estate under the cover of darkness. The harvest kept everyone distracted in the fields, their voices carrying across the rows. He carried a small tube of industrial glue and slipped into the cellar corridor. The heavy oak door had a simple latch, one that could be sealed quickly by forcing a thin bead of glue directly into the mechanism. He coated it carefully, working slowly to avoid making noise. Then he waited for his chance. That night, Marco approached Paolo with a calm suggestion. The barrels, he said, might be over-fermenting. He urged Paolo to check them before morning or risk losing an entire batch. To a man like Paolo, whose pride rested on the quality of his wine, such a warning could not be ignored. Paolo trusted his own judgment above all and decided to inspect the cellar himself. A field hand later recalled seeing Paolo descend into the cellar around midnight, a lantern in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The worker thought nothing of it until some time passed and faint banging came from behind the door. The sound was weak, as though muffled by thick stone walls. When the worker tried the latch, it refused to turn. It was stuck solid. The worker called for help. Others arrived and tried forcing the door, but the latch would not budge. The banging grew less frequent, then stopped. No one knew how long Paolo had struggled inside, surrounded by the invisible gas rising from the barrels. The lantern's glow faded until the cellar returned to silence. By dawn, worried workers gathered in the corridor. They pried at the latch with iron bars until the door splintered open. A rush of stale air spilled out. Inside, Paolo was slumped against the largest barrel, his lantern cold beside him. The air smelled strongly of fermenting grapes, sharp and suffocating. His face was drained of color, his body still. Investigators found the latch had been glued to the mechanism. Traces of the same industrial adhesive were traced to a tube Marco purchased in Siena weeks earlier, and a partial fingerprint in the dried glue matched his record. Confronted with the evidence, Marco admitted he had prepared the trap. He was arrested, and the case was ruled an act of revenge carried out with knowledge only a vintner could possess. The vineyard never stopped. Harvest continued that same week, though workers moved through the rows in silence. For them, the vines were no longer just a source of wine, but a reminder of how one family feud had ended in calculated death. It was July 18th, 2018, in Singapore, and the night air was warm and heavy. Rain from earlier in the evening still clung to the streets, and the glow from streetlights reflected off the wet pavement. At the edge of the central district, the main city library was winding down for the day. Running this busy facility was Daniel Wong, a 44-year-old head librarian known for being methodical, keeping the building's operations running with strict routines and careful oversight. Earlier that year, safety checks revealed repeated problems with the elevators and other systems. The library's maintenance supervisor, Lee Han, had been warned several times to keep up with inspections, but failed to file reports on time. After several missed deadlines, Daniel dismissed him from his position. Lee left the job quietly, but he carried years of technical knowledge of the building and a growing resentment toward the man who had forced him out. Lee knew the library building better than anyone. For years, he had handled its mechanical systems, including the service elevators used by staff to move supplies between floors. He knew every override panel, every interlock, and every shutoff switch hidden in the service corridors. He understood how the safety systems worked and how they could be disabled. Losing his job did not take away that knowledge, and it was that knowledge he would later use for revenge. On a quiet evening, weeks later, Lee entered the library's service area after hours. Using an old access code he had never returned, he bypassed the electronic lock and slipped into the narrow corridor behind the staff elevators. The hallway was dim and silent, lit only by a single emergency light. There, he disabled the safety interlock that prevented elevators from moving when maintenance was underway. He also bypassed the kill switch designed to keep the cab stationary when someone was on top of it. He worked carefully, making sure each wire was disconnected in a way that would not trigger an alarm. The trap was set. He left the building the same way he came in, unnoticed. The next morning, Lee phoned the library's service desk from a prepaid mobile phone. He reported that one of the staff lifts was jammed between floors and acting strangely. Daniel, known for being hands-on and unwilling to wait for outside help, decided to inspect it himself before calling for professional repair. He grabbed a flashlight from his office and headed toward the dim corridor leading to the service shaft. A junior staffer later recalled seeing Daniel step into the narrow passage, his flashlight beam cutting across the concrete walls. The staffer heard him muttering about checking the car roof for a mechanical fault. He said something about it probably being a loose cable or misaligned sensor. Moments later, the service elevator groaned and began to rise, even though no call button had been pressed. The movement was slow at first, then faster. A sudden shout echoed inside the shaft. The staffer froze in place, unsure of what was happening. Then came a metallic clatter, the sound of Daniel's flashlight striking the concrete floor below. By the time the worker reached the doorway and looked inside, the sounds had already gone silent. The elevator had stopped moving. When others arrived and the power was cut to the system, the elevator was found pressed tight against the top of the shaft. Daniel had climbed onto the cab roof to inspect the mechanism and was pinned in the narrow ceiling space above, his body wedged between steel and concrete. There had been less than a foot of clearance. The damage was instant and fatal. Investigators discovered the interlock had been manually bypassed and the kill switch disabled. Security footage showed a man entering the service corridor the night before using an old access code. His build and gait matched Lee Han, the former supervisor. In his apartment, police later found tools coated with grease from the library's elevator system and printouts of the building's mechanical diagrams. He was arrested within a week, and the case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with technical precision. It was May 30th, 2015, in Key Largo, Florida, and the morning was clear and calm. The water was flat inside the reef line, and charter boats idled along the channel. On a small dive boat tied off near a coral wall, students listened to a short briefing before their first descent. Leading the group was Mark Grant, a 32-year-old scuba instructor at a small neighborhood dive club. Mark worked year-round teaching entry-level classes. In the weeks before the dive, rumors spread that he had started seeing the girlfriend of one of the club's advanced divers. The rival was older, bitter, and had keys to the gear shed from past volunteer work. He knew the equipment well, where the compressors were and which tanks Mark used. Mark's cylinders were easy to spot with his initials stenciled near the boot. Late one night, the rival unlocked the storage cage and rolled Mark's favorite tank to the bench near the compressor room. He cracked the valve to bleed it down to 0, then clipped a whip from a tall supply bottle and refilled the cylinder with pure nitrogen. He set the pressure to normal, about 3,000 psi, so the gauge would look right in the morning. He wiped the tank with a rag, returned it to the rack, and locked the cage behind him. The swap took only minutes. There was no analyzer on the club table because the class was using standard air, not nitrox. No one would think to test it. The next day, the group prepared for a training dive to 40 feet along a coral wall. Mark checked his gear on the boat deck. He opened his valve, checked his pressure, and took a few breaths from the regulator. Everything seemed normal. Nitrogen feels no different until you're under pressure. The hiss was clean, the gauge read full. The group descended in pairs. An eyewitness student said Mark led at the front, a few yards above the sand. 5 minutes into the dive, his movements changed. He reached for the line but missed. His kicks became erratic. His eyes appeared glassy behind the mask, and his movements lost coordination. He fumbled with his regulator, and it slipped from his mouth. Bubbles frosted his mask as it flooded. A diver next to him tried to donate air with an octopus regulator, but Mark did not bite down. His hands were slow and uncoordinated, moving as though he could not understand what was happening. In seconds, he went limp. The assistant diver grabbed his harness and began a controlled ascent, kicking hard toward the surface. But the class had spread out along the reef. 2 more students surfaced early in a panic, waving at the boat and shouting for help. The captain threw a tagline and radioed for emergency help. When the crew rolled Mark over the transom, he was unresponsive. Another dive boat had sent down a rescue diver to help lift him from the bottom after he began to sink. That diver later said only Mark's gear looked wrong. Everyone else returned, breathing hard but normal. Back at the dock, the club quarantined the equipment. The sheriff's office sealed the cylinder and took it for testing. The gas analysis told the story. The seized tank showed no measurable oxygen, only nitrogen. The other students' cylinders, sampled from the same fill batch, tested as normal compressed air at roughly 21% oxygen. The problem was not the compressor or the boat. It was a single tank. Investigators pulled the shop's entry logs and camera clips from the alley behind the gear shed. The night before the dive, the rival's key fob opened the cage just before 10:45 p.m. A security camera caught his truck backing up to the side door and his silhouette moving across the compressor room window. In his garage, deputies found a valve wrench with fresh tool marks and a partially drained industrial nitrogen bottle used for gas blending. His phone showed a late-night search for an oxygen analyzer, not required for air. Confronted with the test results and the entry logs, he admitted he had swapped a tank to teach him a lesson. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a premeditated act of revenge carried out with simple knowledge of scuba equipment. The club padlocked its gear shed and posted a sign on the counter: analyzers required for any personal cylinders. Word spread fast along the Florida Keys. Divers talked quietly about how a normal gauge reading and a familiar hiss could still hide an empty breath. It was November 6th, 2015, in London, and the rain had just cleared from the West End streets. Inside the Harrington Playhouse, rehearsals were underway on the dim stage. Among the cast was Simon Gray, a 26-year-old understudy who had recently been promoted to a lead role. Simon had stepped in after the original actor, Edward Price, left in anger. Edward had been vocal about losing the part, arguing with directors and crew before storming out. Though dismissed, he still knew the theater well. Before acting, Edward had worked stagehand jobs where he learned the ropes, pulleys, and counterweight systems that moved curtains and backdrops. That knowledge would later become the means of his revenge. The counterweight system used in the Harrington Playhouse was old but effective. Sandbags balanced the heavy curtains and scenery flats, allowing a single person to raise or lower them. Each weight was stitched in canvas and stacked neatly in the fly loft above the stage. In the dark, they all looked the same. Edward knew he could tamper with one without raising suspicion. On a quiet night before rehearsal, he entered through a side door using the access card he still had. Stagehands often left latches loose, so no one noticed he was inside. He located the set of weights assigned to the main curtain and removed one sandbag. In its place, he hung a look-alike sack filled not with sand, but a solid concrete block weighing nearly 80 pounds. He stitched the canvas tight to hide the shape, brushed dust across the seams, and returned the line to its original position. To the eye, nothing looked unusual. To the hand, The weight felt the same on the rope until it dropped the following afternoon. The cast gathered for rehearsal. The house lights were dimmed, and only the stage lamps burned. Simon stood at the wing, following cues with the script tucked under one arm. As part of his entrance, he needed to pull the curtain line. Several actors nearby remembered watching him step to the rope, plant his feet, and give it a firm tug. At first, the curtain shifted normally. Then came the sound of a rope hissing through pulleys, followed by a sharp crack overhead. Before anyone could react, the disguised counterweight plunged. It fell straight down the guide track and struck Simon on the top of his head with enough force to collapse him instantly to the stage. His script scattered across the boards as he dropped. One castmate shouted in panic while others froze in silence. A thin cloud of plaster dust drifted from the rafters, stirred loose by the jolt of the falling block. Stagehands who had been adjusting lights rushed forward but stopped short at the sight. The block rolled once before settling, its canvas cover torn to reveal gray concrete beneath. The rehearsal ended in chaos. Someone called for emergency services, while others gathered in small, stunned groups near the footlights. The theater went silent, except for the hum of the old lamps overhead. Investigators later examined the rigging. The weights were cataloged, and only one was abnormal. Tests confirmed the block weighed nearly double the normal counterweight. Security checks revealed Edward's access card had been used at the side door the night before, long after official crew hours. When officers searched his flat, they found stitching tools, leftover canvas, and traces of powdered cement on his workbench. He was arrested within days. The case was ruled a deliberate act of sabotage carried out with knowledge only an insider would possess. It was August 21st, 2017, in Santa Monica, California, and the boardwalk was quiet after midnight. Inside the amusement park, the rides were dark except for scattered service lights. The only machine running was the Thunder Drop roller coaster, a steel track that wound through tunnels and sharp curves. Maintenance crews often sent cars through test runs before opening or after repairs. Running this section was Marcus Allen, a 35-year-old senior ride operator. Marcus had worked the coaster for years and was trusted to oversee safety checks. He also had a reputation among staff for being harsh with junior workers. Several trainees had filed complaints about his bullying, but supervisors rarely acted on them. One of those complaints came from Leah Ramos, a seasonal employee who eventually quit. Her concerns went unanswered, but her brother Ethan worked nearby and had access to maintenance diagrams of the coaster. He studied the track, noting where a blind tunnel passed close to a service platform. That section, hidden from the main midway, became central to his plan. On a night when inspections were scheduled, Ethan entered the service area with a length of steel cable. He stretched it across the tunnel opening at neck height, fastening it tightly to anchor points on either side. The dim bulbs inside the tunnel gave little reflection, and from the front seat of a speeding car, the cable would be almost invisible. Once set, he left through a staff exit. The cable remained taut, waiting. Later that night, Marcus prepared for a routine single-car test run. A janitor working nearby saw him unlock the gate, step into the loading bay, and settle into the front seat. With no passengers and no fanfare, the restraints clicked shut. The car rolled forward, gathering speed as it climbed the first hill. The sound of wheels rattled up the incline and disappeared into the structure. Moments later, the janitor paused his sweeping. The usual echoes of the ride, the roar of descent, and the screech of turns were cut short. Instead, there was a sudden silence, broken only by the ocean wind. Minutes passed until the car coasted slowly back into the station. Marcus sat slumped in the seat. His upper body leaned forward, unmoving. Across his neck was a severe laceration, the cut running straight across. The janitor, stunned, later told investigators he noticed a brief glint inside the tunnel before hearing a sharp snap. The cable had broken loose after the strike, one end dangling from the platform rail. The test run was halted immediately. Park security sealed the coaster and kept workers back. Maintenance crews examined the tunnel and found the remnants of the steel line still bolted at one end, the other frayed from force. Investigators traced the tampering to tool marks, matching wrenches found in Ethan Ramos's garage. Records showed he had obtained the blueprints months earlier through a contractor friend. He was arrested within a week. The case was ruled a calculated act of revenge carried out with precision inside the hidden structure of the ride. The Thunder Drop stayed locked behind steel gates. For weeks, locals walked past the coaster in silence, knowing the ride that once brought excitement had become the stage for a killing disguised as a test. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.